this semester. And this particular lecture is unique in that it's also the first uh, I'm sorry, the second lecture in a the Maya Living Legacy, which is a year-long campus-wide lecture series on topics related to Mayan history, culture, politics, scientific knowledge, and language. And I'm going to go ahead and post the link to those talks as well really quickly. So just anyone who's interested can access those if you're interested. Sorry, 1 second. Let me go to the chat and put that link in there for everybody. Okay, let me go back to my share screen. So now that we're done with those logistical issues, I'd also like to mention other than language sciences, there's many other units that were instrumental in coordinating this series that Rusty Barrett will kick off for us here in language sciences. Those include LASIS, agroecology, the Department of Plant and Agro-System Sciences, the Robert F. and Jeannie Holtz Center for Science and Technology Studies, and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. So thanks to language sciences and all of those other units for contributing to this great lecture series. So it's a real pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, Rusty Barrett, who is a professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Kentucky. His work can be divided into broadly the intersection of language, gender, and sexuality on the one hand, and then on the analysis of a wide range of linguistic and sociolinguistic issues in the Mayan language family, with a focus primarily on the Quichean branch of the Mayan languages spoken in Guatemala. Rusty has made extremely important contributions to both those areas and received awards from prestigious national institutions such as the Linguistic Society of America and the Society for Linguistic Anthropology for his work. So I don't really want to take too much time up saying more. I could go on and on about Rusty's work, but I'll turn it over to him. The title of today's talk is Language Ideologies and Cultural Continuity in the Maya Renaissance. So thanks again for being here, Rusty. We're really honored to have you.
Yeah. Okay. Can you see that?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. So what I want to talk about today is the role of language ideology in cultural continuity, particularly in the current context of what I'm calling the Maya Renaissance. For those of you who might not know, this is the sort of chart of the Mayan languages. The languages that I tend to focus on are the sort of languages in what's sometimes called Quichean proper. Today I'll be talking some about Quiche and a lot about Tutujil. Just a little background. So the sort of traditional sort of hegemonic view of the Maya officially in Guatemala has been for a long time that the Maya civilization collapsed before Europeans came and that indigenous Guatemalans aren't really connected to the pre-Columbian Maya. People say that they shouldn't really call themselves Maya because they're not related and all these sorts of things. And so there's been a lot of reaction against that. And I want to sort of emphasize cultural continuity in the way language use works. Just a bit of context of sort of how the current sort of renaissance of Mayan culture sort of emerged. So basically slavery or forced labor was legal in Guatemala up until 1947. Um, in 1950, uh, Arbenz was elected as president of Guatemala, and he was returning land that had been taken from the Maya back to American fruit companies. Um, America didn't like that, and so the CIO overthrew the Guatemalan government and put a dictator in his place. This led to a civil war that lasted until the 1990s. The U.S. actually trained military, provided arms and money to support the Guatemalan army. The idea was that they were fighting communism, but it was really more of an ethnic genocide. There were many entire communities, entire villages burned. Many people were exiled, and so on. So what's sometimes called the Maya movement, even though it isn't sort of an organized singular movement, but a series of different sort of things promoting Mayan languages and cultures, emerged sort of towards the end of the Civil War in the late 1980s. Some people might say earlier. And it really has gained momentum in the period since. Um, and so there's a sort of new generation of Maya intellectuals and creative artists. And so I'll be talking about visual art, music, and literature, and how they sort of all relate to ideologies of how language ought to be used. Right? So the Renaissance in Guatemala contains a lot of sort of amazing things that are happening. So there's a lot of new literature written in Mayan languages. There's artists who are sort of doing innovative Maya perspective art. This is Manuel Chavajay, who's sort of internationally recognized. People are playing the ball game again, and so on. So the area that I'm going to talk about mostly is the area around Lake Atitlan, and in particular, the Tutuhil area. So there are 3 languages around the lake. And I'm going to be talking about my work with a Tutuhil rapper named Tutu Baktum Khan, who is from sort of near the division between Tutuhil and Quiche. So he originally, Tutu formed a group called Balamakpu. So you can see this is the part of their logo for those of you who read glyph or don't read glyph, it says hip hop. Um, the their music has rap in Spanish and in Maya. Tutu raps in Maya, mostly Tutuhil, but he includes some Kaqchikel and Quiche. So I know that speakers of Quiche sort of say they can totally understand his language, even though it's not their language. And I first sort of reached out to Tutu because someone had sent me his music, and I was really amazed by the way the structure of his hip hop lyrics followed the pattern you would find in hieroglyphic texts or colonial documents. And so I met with him in Guatemala and asked him, how did you learn this? And he said, oh, no, it's not. It's because I don't actually write the lyrics. The lyrics are written by the Nahuales or the spirits and the ancestors. So I didn't really learn it. I'm just transmitting it. He would say he's downloading lyrics from the spirits, right? Just to give you a sense of their music. Nakchega winake makakamontaki, nakchega winake kasilontaki, nakchega winake ekayinebi, nakchega winake mekamisantebi. So that's actually from a school that Balamaku started that teaches sort of focuses on language revitalization through having kids create hip hops in their languages, as well as learning about traditional Mayan things. Right? Sorry. So in terms of language ideologies, right? It's, as cross-critique has argued, there are always sort of assemblages of language ideologies. So different beliefs about how language should be used in particular contexts. So we can think of language ideologies as a network of in indexical signs that point to sort of normative ways of speaking in a particular context or interacting, how sociality works in a particular language situation. What people sort of see as aesthetically pleasing in verbal art and speech play and things like that, right? So I want to talk about three sort of broad, really broad ideas about language and how it should flow through the world or how it is seen as flowing through the world. And those are balance, that interactions should be balanced, both in terms of grammar, but also in terms of interlocutors. And then multivocality, that interaction doesn't have to be binary just between two speakers. It can involve a large group of speakers, and talk about that in a bit. And then directionality, that the movement of language in sort of Mayan language ideologies is three-dimensional as opposed to sort of the two-dimensional view of language that we have in linguistics. So in terms of balance, there are a number of things that that happen in interactions that are part of sort of maintaining balance between the people who are speaking to each other. So it's common to sort of avoid disagreement. So and anything that causes and someone to feel sorry for you or someone to be jealous of you or envious of you is something that you should avoid in a interaction, right? So in fact, if you once I was talking to a really good friend of mine, and I was in sort of a situation that I thought was not going to be able to be resolved, and I started to cry. She immediately turned her back to me, but continued talking as if nothing had changed other than we weren't facing each other. So that's part of the avoidance of sort of pulling emotions into public, right? So there's also a preliminary sort of agreement that often happens, right? So often if you disagree with someone, you will say you agree first, and then you will sort of continue the conversation until you tell them that they're totally wrong. And it's sort of like when we say, can you pass the salt? We don't mean, are you physically able to pass the salt? People realize that that initial agreement is a marker of a politeness marker rather than actual agreement, right? So glyphs are read in sort of pairs. So we'll be talking a lot about pairs, and you'll notice the sort of way that that glyphs are read follows this downward back and forth pattern, which we'll get to later on. Okay? So in terms of sort of pairings or things that sort of balance each other out within the grammar of Mayan languages, it's quite common to have a lot of diphrastic endings or compound words that are put together and have a distinct meaning apart from what they would sort of mean individually. So, for example, fighting tooth and nail in English doesn't mean that you just fought with one tooth and one nail, right? It means something bigger. And this type of compound is really, really common in Mayan languages in general. So the ideal sort of poetic couplet or pairing of lines in any sort of poetry is to have syntactically parallel sentences where one constituent has been changed. It could be the verb, it could be a noun, but there's one sort of shift. And ideally, in sort of the most aesthetically pleasing way, the two words that change, the alternates, actually form a diphrastic kinning on their own. Right? This is an example from a vase from Naranjo. You can see his planting of the trees, his planting of stone. You can see here that it's the same repetition, so it makes a parallel in the glyphs. But tree and stone together means construction. So he didn't. So planting stones and planting trees is to build things, right? And that's sort of an ideal pattern. It's also something you see in things like Tutu Bakhtun Khan's lyrics. So here, don't for let's go, my children, don't forget our language. Let's go, my children, don't forget our clothing. So our clothing, our language, our clothing is sort of fairly new diphrastic kinning to refer to Mayan culture in general. So language and clothing are the things that are sort of most enduring across time and um, still markers of Maya identity. So pairing them together sort of reflect is means the entire culture. Right? So that couplet structure that you get in poetry is similar to how conversations work. So in Mayan conversations, the most common back channel is to repeat whatever the last thing the person before you said. Jill Brody has written a lot about this, and this example comes from her. And you see, well, I didn't meet the bus. Well, you didn't meet the bus. So this repetition, the subject is switched, right? So that it sort of follows the regular couplet pattern that you find in poetry. Maya poetics is sort of built on these types of parallel structures at different levels. So you have a phonological parallelism where particular sounds are repeated, not in a rhyming way. So, for example, Maya hip hop never rhymes. But it has couplets and it has parallelisms between sounds. So here, the similar sounds and ch with the final ich syllables are sort of repeated in this verse I'm about to play. So it's teaching how to do a traditional ceremony, basically. It's similar patterns happen with morphological sort of elements. So you have repeated pairs or repetitions of particular suffixes or prefixes. In this example, which is also from Tutu's lyrics, you have the suffix al, which makes an abstract noun out of an everyday noun. So for example, means a general sort of cord or vine, but amal means umbilical cord in this case. Right? So you see that it's repeated on a lot of different elements throughout the lyrics. Right? And then the sort of syntactic parallelism where you have a substituted constituent is is everywhere in Maya culture. This is an example of a different musical group. This is a group called Kabawil that sings in Quiche. And they're saying, I traveled the roads where my grandfather walked. I traveled the roads where my father walked. Basically, another couplet, right? Okay, so you find similar sort of parallelisms in literature and art, often related to pairing the four corners, the cardinal directions. Right? And the cardinal directions correspond to the four sort of types of corn. And the colors that are associated with the four directions were colors of corn. Right? This is a poem originally in Anjobal that basically just says the directions and the type of corn that goes with them. So it's a traditional sort of way of tying corn to the cardinal directions. Right? So there's a traditional sort of order of how the directions are used in ritual speech. But this four-way pattern is also used in Balamakus music. So this is the opening of their song Ahmak, which is my favorite song of theirs because it's my day. Uh,
Не топчіть доріжку.
So those four voices actually make a couplet structure just with vocalizations, right? They're not actually singing lyrics. But the so in sort of Sutu's way of sort of seeing things, the four colors relate to the what he sees as the four races of humans, as well as the four directions. And so you have couplets that link directions in different ways. The pitches make a different pattern. The gender of singers makes yet a different pattern, so that it's similar to what you find in poetry in that you have sort of these different things that are parallel combined in distinct ways. Okay, the next sort of broad idea about a language I want to talk about is multivocality. So language interaction doesn't have to be just two people talking back and forth. And in my communities, at least in Kichean communities, often when two people are speaking together, there's not much of a pause because people are back channeling through repeating what was just said. And it's sometimes expected for someone to speak for someone else. And speech that overlaps is totally common. So if the rituals that are used to sort of call forth the nawals um, actually sort of add voices so that you start with a single sort of nawal and you add multiple ones to it until you've sort of activated all of them. And so this multivocality occurs both in sort of language and in, well, we'll see other things maybe. So we tend to sort of presume the two heads that Saussure sort of gave us, that a conversation is meant to go back and forth between two individuals. The aesthetics of sort of having people talk at the same time is, I think, related to a sort of view of humanity that Demis Tedlock talks about, called Breath on the Mirror, is what the name of his book. So that when humans first were made, they could see everywhere. They could see over mountains, through mountains, anything that was there, they could see it without having to move. And the creators decided that they sort of knew too much, and they blinded them in a way so that it was as if they were looking through into a fogged up mirror. In other words, you have to sort of focus to actually see things, but there are more things there that you might not sort of recognize. And this overlapping speech is common throughout Mesoamerica. This is an example of a political debate from Hilaria Cruz, who is Chatino, right, in Oaxaca. So, so you can see that all the candidates are just talking at the same time, and you have to sort of sort through them to sort of figure out what each person is sort of saying or doing. And this is this sort of seeing through and finding sort of small things within larger pictures is a basic sort of aesthetic uh, ideology within Mayan communities. So you see it in pre-Columbian art quite a bit, where there's just so much going on. There are all these little elements that contribute to understanding what it is, and you really have to focus to see what's actually there, right? This is also something you see in Maya textiles in huipiles. So for example, looking at this picture, if you weren't accustomed to Ishil weaving, you might just think this is a random pattern, right? But actually, it's a representational image, right? So you have two birds, right? Two horses, and two people wearing hats and earrings and a dress. Um, so that what you sort of see um, when you sort of first glance at something may not be what's actually happening, and you have to zoom in to sort of see, right? So having seen that, you can probably notice that this has birds, that this has humans, horses. This is a horse with a bird on its back, uh, and so on, right? Um, there's an example from Nawala that's representing traditional dancers, but there are also a lot of other things happening. So this is a turkey. Uh, this is a monkey. Um, uh, these are baby chickens. That's a rooster. So there's stuff in the patterns that are actually sort of representational or optical illusions that you have to sort of see. That's part of this aesthetic. One of the sort of artists of the Tutuhil art movement, Julian Coche Mendoza, uses this sort of seeing through aesthetic in his work, sort of obscuring sort of everyday things where if you look carefully, you can start to see something different than you saw at the beginning, right? So this sort of listening through, similar to sort of looking through at something like a Wipio, um, tends to follow the pattern that you find in ritual speech of the addition of voices onto one another. And it's traditional way of that you find in traditional Maya music, where there are things happening that are sort of individual voices that come together in ways that a lot of, for people who aren't Maya, that may sound like they don't necessarily fit together. Um, when a reporter once asked Tutu what music the pre-Columbian Maya listened to, he said, obviously hip hop, because of the way they combine voices together to recreate a particular aesthetic environment, in this case, the forest. Right? So this is the Rabin al-Achian opera that's been a dance opera that's been performed since before the conquest. So you can see how things are sort of, each instrument is acting more independently than they might in Western style music. And you find the same sort of addition of voices in the music of Balamaku. Sagrada Milpa, Balama, this one's for you. Come on. Original, once again, all the way from Guatemala Islands. So you may notice Guatemala rather than Guatemala because it's the Maya homeland. And I don't know if you could hear, but there's a parrot that repeats in there, so that as part of the addition of voices is recreating the sound of being in the forest. You have similar sort of things in literature. So this is Humberto Abad, who sort of the most famous Maya poet to write in Mayan languages. This is a poem called Shiri Shitem Chikop, or Bird Songs. And he's just saying the names of different birds and treating them as if they're the actual song of the bird. So they're not necessarily onomatopoetic names. So some of them are like whiteface, right? But he's producing them as if they were actual bird calls. So it's sort of like if you said, cardinal, cardinal, duh. So here you go. And this is his remix where he put his voice together with his own voice.
Please, 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 please. Choke, choke. Please, 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 please. Choke, sonun. Choke, please, 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 please. Choke, sonun. Please, 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 please. Whistle, 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 whistle. Sonun, sonun, sonun. Whistle, 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 sonun.
So you get the idea. Sort of this additive style is aesthetically pleasing, both in music or poetry or what have you. The last sort of broad idea I want to talk about is directionality. So the sort of Maya understanding of language is three-dimensional, so that interactions between humans tend to happen on the sort of horizontal axis, but interactions with ancestors or the Nawals move along a vertical axis. So it's sort of like if you've heard of flatland, the idea that people in flatland can only experience two dimensions, and if they see something three-dimensional sort of moving through, they interpret it differently because they can't see above or below. So it's similar to that. The upward vertical movement reflects the world tree that's sort of centers sort of everything. It's also the sort of Milky Way with the Big Dipper at the top. It's the representation of the road, the white road to the afterlife, right? And so the sort of cosmic tree is centered sort of by the four cardinal directions. When in traditional sort of ceremonies, this is an example from Bill Hanks, the sort of most important sort of spirits or nahuales that you will sort of call forth are sort of at the top, highest in the sky, and then you move counterclockwise downward, making a sort of spiral. And then by the time you've gotten to the bottom, all of those voices have combined, similar to what you saw in the poem by Al-Kabal, for example. Okay? So the spirits sort of reside at different points along a vertical axis. And the movement downward sort of is a general part of all sorts of things in Maya culture. So, for example, if you're familiar with what are sometimes called the pole dancers, which there you see that there are four in the four cardinal directions, and they move downward, sort of going further out as they go down, right? So that they make the same sort of spiral movement, exactly what movement you would make if you were calling forth the Nahuales. Right? Traditional ceremonies typically involve fires, where the fire is the smoke that moves vertically is a way of communicating with ancestors or Nahuales, depending on context. And you'll see that it has the four cardinal directions sort of laid out. And this is one orange for every day in the 260-day calendar. You usually want to include something that will be pleasing to ancestors, for example. So this one is mostly fruit. And when it is all set on fire, it is a way of communicating, and the things that the fire does in terms of movements can actually sort of be communication back from the Nahuales. So, yeah. And so this basic type of ceremony goes back to pre-Columbian sort of times. There are lots of examples of really similar burning ceremonies happening, right? Yeah, this is another example. Similarly, when there are formations in the land that seem to be something pushing up from inside the earth, or when there are caves, those are downward ways of communicating with the underworld, say. And they're also often sort of viewed as sacred places, right? So this one in Chichicastenango is Pascualabaj. Habaj just means rock. And the Pascual is the name of this particular rock. So the offerings and candles are similar to what you would do in a burning ritual, but they are moving in the other direction in some ways. Okay? In Chiapas, it's even before the conquest, graves were marked with a cross that represented the world tree. So basically, the Milky Way and then the axis along which the constellations move. And on the Day of the Dead, in some parts of Chiapas, they have doors over graves, and they open the door on the Day of the Dead so that it makes it possible for the ancestors to move vertically through space. Okay? Similarly, All Saints' Day is celebrated with kites because kites are moving up towards the sky and also are a way of communicating with the ancestors. So there are a lot of ways that language moves up and down that are different from what we might think of. And you get this sort of verticality also in music and art, as we'll see in a sec. So these are the openings of different songs from Balamaku, and they tend to start with either birds or flutes, sort of airy things. Then you get strings, human voices, and then drums. So the word for drum is the word for stone, so that at that point you're down to the earth. So you have the same sort of vertical motion.
לא כל לך ישימו לב, חוכת שכיח, חכו תוך צ'אווה לא כל לך ציקים.
The other one does the same thing.
Are you ready?
Sorry.
Umber me the Maya, the Inca, the Aztec.
I'm not going to play alphabet because it has birds and it always makes my dog go crazy, and I know he will bark. So the sort of vertical movement is sort of one of the most central tropes in contemporary Maya art. This is an example where you can see the sort of four directions, the ceremony, and sort of corn moving up in the same way. The really most sort of typical sort of type of art in the sort of revival in Sutu Hill art tends to be things that look down onto the world. So things that are sort of viewed from above. So this is a painting of the market from above, but you also get paintings from below. So here you can see people's feet, for example. This again, market from above. They're all sort of similar. This is looking from feet upward. Okay. As is this, looking downward, right? And so on. So the art also has this sort of emphasis on verticality, which is a really uniquely Maya way of seeing how language moves through the world. So, just to summarize, these sort of three really broad um, understandings of language, that it should be balanced, that it shouldn't be sort of limited to just two people, and that it should move up and down as well as back and forth, are sort of elements that not only sort of preserve sort of Maya uses of language, but also connect to understandings of Maya cosmology and how the world works. And therefore, sort of through ways that language is traditionally used, being transmitted, we can sort of see a cultural continuity going back to pre-Columbian times. Right? Just to give you one last example, you can see all of the things I've been talking about, and this is the cover from the Balang whose record of the tribute to the 20 Nawales. And you can see it has hieroglyphic Maya, it has Maya, it has Spanish, so it's multivocal. You have this sort of pairing, so you have the twins, which is a regular sort of trope in Mayan culture, right? And you have directionality, so this is the days or nawals in the Mayan calendar as they would be sort of cycled through in a upward or downward movement. So, so what I'm trying to argue is that these sort of basic understandings of language use are really central to the transmission of cultural traditions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Rusty. That was great. So we have time for questions. You can either write the questions in the chat, raise your hand. Anyone would like to start?
I have a quick
Go ahead,
question,
Laura.
maybe.
Yeah.
Hi,
Hi,
Rusty.
Laura.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. You're right
Um,
next to Maria.
isn't that a nice coincidence? Uh, and and yeah, this is sort of, I'm interested in the kind of language mixing that you described. So you described there's Tutuhil, Quiche, and is it Kaqchikel happening all in the mix, being pulled in. And I was wondering if that sort of parallels the communities, around the lake, if many of them are multilingual, and then also the kind of intended audience, if much of the listeners and recipients are multilingual. Yeah.
Yes, so all of those. So the lake sort of creates a sort of dialect continuum going between the three languages. And many people are sort of able to go back and forth between the three languages. And Tutu is from a town that's basically a 5-minute walk from a Quiche speaking town. So that he's really familiar. His mother actually speaks Quiche. And so he consciously sort of combines things in a way that will make his lyrics more understandable to speakers of different languages. So he intentionally sort of will adjust words to where sometimes it's not the way it would be pronounced in any of the three languages, but it's pronounced in a way that makes it recognizable to everyone.
And then I was wondering if any of the parallelisms are ever cross-linguistic or ever language mixed, or if they are always contained within one of the languages.
So yeah, usually if they're in a mix, they're both in the same mix. If that makes sense. So the parallelism might include things from multiple languages, but again, they would be interpretable to speakers of multiple languages. So I don't know that you would necessarily have code switching in a couplet, but you can have mixing in a different kind of way.
Cool, thanks.
I have a question about the motion that you mentioned. Now you said that there wasn't a lot of rhyming. I'm wondering if phonetically, again, I don't know how many of these languages work, but is there any sound symbolism in like height, forwardness, backness in the phonetics that's utilized at all with some of these motion qualities?
That's a really good question. I haven't really looked specifically at how, say, vowel sounds are correlate with height, for example, or verticality. No, that's a really good question. I don't know. But it wouldn't be surprising to me if that was happening.
Yes, thank you so much. It was absolutely fascinating talk. I learned so much, and lots of what I know about Yucatec Renaissance, Yucatec Maya Renaissance, is very parallel there, and the onomatopoeic character of the language, and the idea that the forest is the teacher of the Mayan language in Pedro Oak. But one question that came to mind is if you see in music and poetry also the aspect of cyclical character of time. In one of the poems that I have analyzed from Yucatan, Lol Cajlay, the flower of my memory, that establishes parallelism with Chilambalam. You know, there are a number of characteristics that you mentioned in terms of the four directions and parallelism and repetition, but then there is also that aspect of time and cyclicality and past being future and future being past. Are you finding any of these as well?
Yeah, so it's you also get sort of cyclical couplets where say 4 lines are repeated more than once, sort of so that you get basically a cycle of words happening. And yeah, I think that partly because the album is one song for each sort of day in the calendar. So the recommendation is that you find out what day today is and start listening to the music on that day and listen to it in a circle so that you're sort of following time in the same way.
Fascinating.
I had a question about the school, Rusty, that Balamaku runs, and if in your experience there you've noticed that their, teaching of children, has that sort of reached a new demographic that might not have been able to, and they might not learn the same kind of things in schools, and if, I don't know, if have they sort of instilled in the younger generation that they can use language in new and exciting ways?
Yeah, so it's sparked sort of widespread sort of movement of people doing hip hop. There's actually a link in the chat of to a group of younger rappers from San Juan La Laguna who have made an amazing video that's entirely in Quiche and in Tutujil and involves the entire village. Yeah. So yes, it's sparked a lot of sort of innovation and attention to sort of music itself. And also sort of pan-Mayanism, so trying to sort of reach out. So Tutu has been recording with Hot Boy Maya, for example, from Yucatan, and his most recent album has 12 different languages, I think, from Guatemala. So.
Great. Yeah, thanks.
If I can ask one more question, following on this recent exchange, what are the debates about connecting not so much different Maya languages, but Maya languages and Spanish in musical and narrative and poetic productions? Because in Yucatan there are a number of different versions of producing literary texts. Some of them are just uniquely in Maya, others are bilingual, and sometimes they are even in a very random way. Part of the text is written in Maya, and then part of the text is written in Spanish. So and each of these ways has its ideology, has its own reasons of.
So there are two rappers. So Tutu raps in Maya, and the other rapper, M. Che, raps only in Spanish. And he takes translations of the Tutu lyrics and creates rhymes out of them, so that there are two voices sort of going on, one that's purely Spanish and one that's purely Maya. So they're mixed together, but they're remixed, I guess you would say. Judy, good to see you.
Thanks. Good to see you. I'm delighted to be able to join you. I was just wondering if maybe you could share a little bit more about the use of glyphs, because this is another big part, I think, of the revitalization, and I'm very impressed by the creative way in which they can recombine the glyphs to make new words, but using the old style.
Yeah, so that's definitely part of this whole Renaissance movement. There are a number of artists who do sort of new things in glyphs and as sort of forms of art. And Tutu is also part of an art collective in San Pedro, and they did a stela in San Pedro. I don't know if you've seen it. That is sort of hieroglyphic Tutu heel on the back, similar to the one in Tecpan. Yeah, they promote glyphs as the kids sort of are learning the glyphs for the different days and things like that. So it's definitely a big part of the revitalization. Yeah.
Thanks.
Ariel, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Hi, I hope you could hear me. I'm having some connectivity issues, sorry. Okay, there we go, it worked. I'm a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I was I was a student of Marika's and the Quiché program, so I've heard so much about you, Dr. Barrett. But I'm really interested in the directionality component that you spoke about, particularly about how vertical interactions are mostly with the natural world and horizontals with other humans. Mostly because for my work, I do work with educators and teacher leaders, so in a very sort of institutionalized setting where Maya folks are. So the scalar dimension is really interesting to me. If I wanted to read more about that, what any recommendations?
Bill Hike's work on Yucatec rituals is probably the most detailed discussion of that aspect of things. Judy might know of other useful sources that escape me at the moment.
Thank you, appreciate it.
No help right now. I have
Okay.
a book that may be coming out next year, which might help, but it's not out now.
Oh, I can't wait.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Any other questions? I guess technically we still have 1 or 2 minutes left. Well, if not, I guess going once, going twice. I
Oh, wait,
don't
there's
see
one
any-
question.
Oh, there is one question. Okay.
Yeah, the answer to the question is, well, so what drew me to Mayan languages? So I was a Russian major as an undergraduate, mainly to upset my parents. And I got a master's degree in Soviet studies 2 weeks before the Soviet Union dissolved. And so I had a degree in something that didn't exist. And I ended up working as a translator from Russian to English for NASA, and it was an actual horrible job. But you had to look like you were reading the entire time. And 1 year I sort of called in sick when I wasn't sick, because it was my birthday and I just wanted to lounge around, and I was flipping through the TV, and an episode of Gumby came on, the sort of green eraser character. And Gumby and Pokey, his pony sidekick, went to visit the ancient Maya, and they saved this. They didn't stay virgin, but that was what was implied, from being thrown into a volcano, because the Maya thought they were gods. And I thought to myself, this is incredibly racist, but I have no idea how to, what to say about it, because I don't know anything about the Maya. So I went and got a book about the ancient Maya, and the chapter on hieroglyphics totally got me excited, and I went back to grad school originally to do that. So it's Gumby is the answer. Okay. Thank you all.
I think that's a great way to end the presentation, right? So thanks again, Rusty. That was fascinating, and I'm glad that this was the first talk of our language sciences colloquium, and I look forward to seeing everybody at future talks. So have a good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Rusty, again for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.